discussion and no action tonight. Am I right about that? Very good. Calvin, take it away.
All right. Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and members of the council. On behalf of the Community and Economic Development Department, we are pleased to share with you the progress made towards updating the city's critical areas ordinance. While the update has been led primarily by CED, this has truly been an act of interdepartmental collaboration with participation from our Parks and Recreation friends and our Public Works and Utilities friends. So thank you to them. These much needed updates have been an opportunity for staff to ensure Title 15 permitting and environmental compliance procedures align development regulations with the goals and policies of the council adopted Vision 2045 Comprehensive Plan. With that, I'd like to introduce Planning Supervisor Ben Broderick and Courtney Bornsworth, our Natural Resources and Grant Administrator, to take you through the presentation.
All right, thank you, Calvin. Mayor and Council, thank you for taking the time tonight to work through the city's critical area ordinance update with us. As you just heard, staff have been hard at work providing these much needed updates to the critical areas ordinance to align the protection standards of these areas with the best available science and the recently adopted Vision 2045 Comprehensive Plan. Tonight, we'll provide the background on our overall development code updates and details on how staff has taken the initiative to look at this critical areas ordinance update as an opportunity to improve the code holistically. We will provide you with an overview of where we currently stand with existing regulation, what the goals and objectives of this critical areas ordinance update are, the process that staff have taken thus far to meet those goals and objectives, where we are headed with these updates, and the progress made to date. We also have some discussion questions that we wanted to frame this presentation with, but more on that later. This presentation is roughly 30 minutes long, so we ask that you please hold questions until the end, as questions early on may be addressed on a later slide. Before we dive in, I'd like to provide a little context and background on the why. Under the Growth Management Act, cities and counties are required to perform a periodic update of their comprehensive plan every 10 years. The city successfully completed and adopted the Vision 2045 plan in December. A big thanks to you all for the feedback and participation in those efforts. With the plan now adopted, the city is also required to update the critical areas ordinance to ensure our development code aligns with best available science and is compliant with all state and legislative requirements. Critical areas are dynamic, and so is the science that dictates how best to manage these areas. We could have taken the regulatory checklist from the state and checked all the boxes and moved on. But now, thanks to council leadership, and a shout out to Councilmember Suggs, we have the staffing capacity. And with Courtney as our natural resources subject matter expert, we've taken the initiative to completely rewrite the code to bring it into the modern era and ensure it provides clear regulatory guidance for staff members, professionals, and property owners alike. We are taking a phased approach to the broader development code update with this very large effort. Phase 1 was treated as the pilot for this project and concerned life safety issues for building and fire regulations and over-the-counter permitting. Council adopted that ordinance in June. Phase 1.5, which concerned GMA and legislative development requirements, was adopted last week. Phase 2 is focused specifically on critical areas. We've decided to break out our urban forestry chapter from the critical areas ordinance to focus more on the ordinance itself, and we are calling urban forestry Phase 2.5. Our hope is to have that in front of you by Q1 2027. Phase 3 will address zoning and development standards directed by the comprehensive plan, and Phase 4 will address remaining zoning, urban development, subdivision, sign code, and secondary development codes. These updates follow a 5-step process. As you might recall, these phases and steps were reviewed and recommended by the Planning Commission and adopted by the City Council as the Planning Commission work plan. This slide is mostly just to illustrate the planning process that staff have coordinated to ensure that each phase of this update is given the time and resources necessary to be successful. For Phase 2 specifically, we began with an internal kickoff, bringing together planning, building, public works, and park staff to establish the scope, timeline, responsibilities, and overall work plan. From there, we moved into code development using regular staff workshops and Department of Commerce Critical Areas Ordinance checklist to draft the new regulatory framework. Public engagement has included stakeholder meetings, the Builders Roundtable discussions, appearances on KONP, public noticing, regular updates to the project webpage, email updates to our legislative listserv gathered from the Comprehensive Plan Periodic Update and ongoing Planning Commission discussions. The fourth step is a public hearing with the Planning Commission and Council adoption. Our public hearing is scheduled for September 23rd, with final Council adoption planned in for November. Finally, implementation is the critical step that focuses on making the new regulations usable through updated web pages, guidance documents, GIS resources, and a critical areas handbook for property owners. As you can see, right now we are starting step 4 with this work session, and we have our final Planning Commission discussion tomorrow night. We'll take what we've learned discussing this update with you tonight to the Planning Commission tomorrow for their consideration. With that orientation on why, I'll turn it over to our intrepid natural resource planner, Courtney Barnsworth, to go over this all in further detail.
Thank you, Ben, and good evening, Mayor and Council. As we move through tonight's work session, I would like you all to consider the following questions. We will revisit these questions again at the end of this presentation during our discussion. 1. What types of activities or uses should the city generally support within or near critical areas? 2. Are there activities or uses the city should approach more cautiously? 3. What factors should guide the city's approach to wetland protection? 4. How proactive should the city be in protecting critical aquifer recharge areas for potential future water use needs? 5. How should the city balance viewshed enhancement with protection of critical areas? 6. What role should the city play in encouraging restoration of previously degraded critical areas? 7. What approach should the city take toward tree retention and management on privately owned property? And 8. What principles should guide tree retention and management so that impacts and benefits are equitable across the community? We will begin the discussion focusing on the city's existing critical areas ordinance, which is regulated under Title 15 Environment. Here, we have chapters dedicated to the city's Shoreline Master Program, State Environmental Policy Act, environmentally sensitive areas, wetlands, and clearing and grading. The existing regulation lacks clarity and readability for both internal and external users of the code. One of the main issues is the current regulation is the use of the term environmentally sensitive areas, which is inconsistent with the common nomenclature of critical areas. The best available science that is currently utilized in protection standards is dated, with the most recent updates to the CAO having occurred in 2016. This update to the Critical Areas Ordinance is much needed and will align the city with the guidance from state agencies and the most recent Comprehensive Plan Periodic Update. The principal target of this update is, again, to align the city's Title 15 with the state-mandated Critical Areas Ordinance. Our objectives go far beyond this target. Staff have been very excited about this update for several reasons. For starters, it gave us an opportunity to do a deep dive into the existing codes that are relevant to trees and critical areas, including Titles 11, Streets and Sidewalks, 13, Public Utilities, and Title 15, Environment. The audit into these titles gave us good perspective into what was working, what wasn't, and where the focus of our efforts should lie. A primary objective of this update is to improve the readability, consistency, and clarity of the code for all users, starting with staff. If staff have been confused by the direction of the code in the past, it's understandable that external users, including property owners and developers, would also be confused. Improving the overall flow and clarity was critical. This code amendment also provided the opportunity to work towards the future development of urban forestry regulatory guidance into the municipal code that aligns to the goals and policies of the Vision 2045 comprehensive and climate resiliency plans. Codifying already established policies related to urban forestry is the best way to get the city one step closer to reaching our tree canopy coverage goals while demonstrating to the community how to best steward the lands on which they live. I want to highlight the importance of beginning the process internally first with members from various departments. Critical areas impact every aspect of the city, so it was important that every department was brought in early on the process. An internal kickoff meeting was held to go over the scope of the project, align goals and outcomes, and to define roles for future discussions. A select team of identified staff have been meeting monthly since the kickoff began in April. The first step in co-development was to perform an analysis of similar jurisdictions, many of whom had completed a CAO update in the last 2 years, in order to develop a structure that allowed for the most clarity and simplicity. With the amendments, staff is recommending Title 15 will look much different than it currently does. The changes will lead to better regulatory clarity and align the city with other similar jurisdictions. Over the course of the last 4 months, staff have been drafting and presenting the code amendments at these regularly scheduled internal meetings with the identified staff members, following the Department of Commerce Critical Areas Ordinance Update checklist closely to ensure compliance with the state. As you heard briefly from Ben, staff have been engaging with the public in multiple ways throughout this process. First, a dedicated page on the city's website was developed to provide background information on the Critical Areas Ordinance, list resources being used through the update, and links to all materials that have been shared with the Planning Commission to date. Several stakeholder meetings have taken place with individuals from various natural resource and development adjacent agencies and organizations in the community to provide staff with feedback from their professional perspectives. Staff also introduced the update to the Builders Roundtable. A newsflash and press release went out at the beginning of the project, and I personally appeared on the Todd Ortloff Show on August 5th to continue the discussion with the public. Lastly, but not least, staff have been working with the Planning Commission since May to go over amendments and receive commissioner and public comment on the drafts. Upon adoption of the Critical Areas Ordinance, a series of implementation projects will begin. The environmental landing page will be updated to include a list of FAQs and links to handbooks that will be developed. Upon adoption, staff will begin working towards drafting an urban forestry management plan to coincide with the 2025 through 2027 Department of Commerce Salmon Planning Grant, understanding the important role a healthy urban forest plays in sustainable, high-quality salmon habitat. The Urban Forest Management Plan will include a best practices handbook that will be readily available to all community members interested in the proper care and stewardship of trees across the landscape. Additionally, a Critical Areas Management Handbook will be developed for property owners, developers, and realtors who own land or are interested in owning land that contains a critical area or buffer. The final document will summarize best practices for the area and include important information on the types of allowed and permitted uses to reduce confusion around permitting requirements. Now that we have a good understanding of where we were and the steps taken thus far, let's continue the discussion on where we're heading. After our thorough analysis into the existing code and how other similar jurisdictions presented their Critical Areas Ordinance, the recommendation was made to restructure the overall Critical Areas chapters into one new chapter titled 1522 Critical Areas. This all-encompassing chapter was redesigned, again, to improve readability and overall transparency regarding critical areas permitting requirements. We will be moving to an article-based chapter, beginning with general provisions and review criteria, and each critical area receiving its own article with specific development standards established. Article 1 will cover general provisions. It contains an updated and consolidated list of definitions applicable to all critical areas, covers the basics of GIS mapping and how they are used in determining critical area boundaries, and provides clarity around the types of uses or activities that are exempt from critical areas review, allowed, and permitted. Under no circumstances does exempting, allowing, or permitting a use give an applicant or property owner the right to impact a critical area in a negative way. Exempt activities or uses are those that are unlikely to result in an impact to a critical area or its buffer due to the nature of the use or previously permitted work. As stated previously, being exempt from the provisions of the chapter does not give an applicant or property owner permission to degrade the critical area or its buffer. The list of exemptions currently defined in the draft code are based on explicit guidance from the Department of Commerce. Examples include emergency situations, the maintenance of lawfully established landscaping and gardens, passive outdoor recreation activities, trail maintenance of existing public and private trails, and forest practices that are regulated by the state. Moving on to allowed uses or activities. These are uses or activities that are unlikely to result in an impact to a critical area or its buffer, and also require a letter to the director stating how the activity or use will not impact the critical area or buffer. The letter must address mitigation sequencing, beginning with avoidance of the action, planned efforts to minimize disturbances, any mitigation necessary should disturbance be caused, so on and so forth. Given that the uses and activities identified as allowed are unlikely to result in an impact, the applicant should easily be able to explain the use or activity they are proposing and how they plan to avoid, minimize, and/or mitigate the impacts of the use or activity on the critical area. Examples of allowed uses or activities include minimal site investigative work for land use and development submittals, minor additions to and modifications of existing structures, the creation of new public and private pedestrian trails, and certain vegetation management practices, including invasive species removal and hazard tree removals. Permitted uses or activities will be processed as Type 2 critical area development permits. This is where the full critical areas review begins to be necessary, as these types of projects typically could result in an impact to a critical area. The proposal must be accompanied with a critical area report prepared by a qualified professional for the affected critical area or areas, and again, must utilize mitigation sequencing throughout the proposal. Some examples of permitted uses include proposals to modify a buffer through either buffer reduction, expansion, or averaging, development in critical areas that have been previously disturbed, development of drainage facilities and stream and wetland buffers, and utility location by a public agency or utility district. Reasonable use exceptions are processed as Type 3 permits and receive final approval or denial by the hearing examiner. The concept of reasonable has often been left to the courts to decide, making it difficult for cities to rule on whether a project qualifies or not. A reasonable use development exception may be granted in situations where all economic use of a property would otherwise be denied by the critical areas regulations. The proposed use must be limited to the minimum necessary to allow for the reasonable economic use of the property that is consistent with other applicable regulations and standards. Compensatory mitigation is needed to offset losses and impacts to the critical area and its buffer to ensure no net loss of functions and values. This illustration demonstrates 4 different proposals adjacent to or within a critical area. Example A shows a proposal that is entirely within the required setbacks for the site and is outside of all critical areas and buffers. A reasonable use exception would not be required in this situation. However, the applicant would need to demonstrate how the proposed use is unlikely to result in an impact on the critical area and buffer. In example B, a reasonable use exception might be granted since there is insufficient space for a reasonable use. The development area would need to be scaled back in size and located where the impact is minimized. Alternatively, a variance may be granted to the required setback to minimize intrusion into the protection area. Example C shows a situation when a reasonable use development exception could be granted to allow for minimal development if the property is completely encumbered and mitigation methods are applied to result in no net loss of ecological functions and values. Example D shows a situation where the city might consider modifications to the required parcel setback to prevent intrusion into the protection area. Moving on to Article 2. Article 2 dictates the review procedures for projects that are likely to impact a critical area or its buffer. This article goes over the specific requirements for critical area reports, mitigation sequencing and mitigation plan requirements, field identification and marking requirements as critical areas are designated, financial guarantees, and how unauthorized uses and enforcement will be handled. Article 3 covers wetlands, one of the 5 regulated critical areas under the GMA. We have updated our definition of wetlands to match the one provided in RCW 3670A030, which is what you see on your screen. Equally as important to understanding what a wetland is what a wetland is not, which is also included in this definition. Wetlands do not include those artificial wetlands intentionally created from non-wetland sites, including but not limited to irrigation and drainage ditches, grass-lined swales, canals, detention facilities, wastewater treatment facilities, farm ponds, and landscape amenities, or those wetlands created after July 1st, 1990 that were unintentionally created as a result of the construction of a road, street, or highway. Wetlands may include those artificial wetlands intentionally created from non-wetland areas created to mitigate conversion of wetlands. Why are wetlands important? They serve numerous important beneficial functions, from reducing erosion, siltation, flooding, ground and surface water pollution, and providing important habitat for fish, wildlife, and plant species. With respect to wetland buffers, the city has been provided 3 options from the Department of Ecology to choose from. Option 1 bases the size of the wetland buffer only on the wetland category that is determined through the wetland rating process. Option 2 bases the buffer width on the wetland category and the intensity of the impact, which can range from high, moderate, to low impacts, depending on the proposed use. Option 3 bases the width of the buffer on the wetland category, the intensity of the impacts, and the functions or special characteristics of the wetland itself. Planning Commission is reviewing these alternatives and providing a recommendation on a preferred alternative at tomorrow's meeting. Critical aquifer recharge areas are defined as those areas with a critical aquifer recharging effect on aquifers used for potable water, including areas where an aquifer that is a source of drinking water is vulnerable to contamination that would affect the potability of the water or is susceptible to reduced recharge, as defined by WAC 365-190-030. The city does not currently use these areas for potable water. However, it would be wise to consider protection standards to avoid reduced water quality and quantity, given the nature of our existing water supply in the Elwha River watershed. This article provides the city with an opportunity to be forward-thinking in our regulation and to begin regulating the types of uses in these areas for future water supplies. Frequently flooded areas include floodplains and other areas that are subject to flooding. They are based on FEMA's flood insurance risk maps and often include the channel migration zone if one exists. Development standards in these areas serve to protect the ecological functions and values of floodplains, while also protecting building infrastructure and people from flood risk. This article directly relates to Chapter 1512, Flood Damage Prevention, which was updated in 2025 with strict oversight from the Department of Ecology and FEMA. The city has several geologically hazardous areas identified. They include landslide, erosion, and seismic hazard areas, including those areas that fall within the tsunami hazard area. Many of these areas overlap with other critical areas, such as our fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. Our marine bluffs and stream ravines are one example of those overlapping areas. The primary purpose of designating these areas is establishing development standards to allow for the natural geologic processes that support and maintain fish and wildlife habitat. It's important that the city consider climate change risks when establishing development standards, particularly in areas that are likely to be more prone to coastal flooding or increased erosion or landslides due to heavier rainfall events. I wanted to spend a few minutes specifically focused on viewshed enhancement. As we all know, one of the things most people value about our city are the sweeping view corridors of the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the Olympic Mountains. The city currently allows for viewshed enhancement in geologically hazardous areas, such as our steep marine bluffs and stream ravines, although the regulation doesn't necessarily correspond to best management practices as it stands. While we don't allow tree topping, we do allow for the removal of individual branches, up to 25% of the living canopy, to assist with opening view corridors. It's rare that this practice is followed, even in situations when permits are received to perform the work, indicating a greater need for enforcement related to malpruning practices. The last article to cover tonight is Article 7, which covers fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. These areas are critically important to the maintenance of certain fish, wildlife, and/or plant populations. Specific to our city, this includes all creeks, kelp and eelgrass beds, and any area that has been designated by either state or federal agencies as having endangered, threatened, or sensitive species or habitats. It is important in establishing development standards for these areas that special consideration be given to anadromous fisheries within our riparian corridors and nearshore habitats. Development and protection standards of these areas should focus heavily on habitat connectivity and establishing adequate buffer zones to limit incompatible uses in these areas that are likely to lead to increased fragmentation across the landscape. In establishing our regulations around these areas, we also need to consider the potential for restoring lost and impaired habitat, which should be required for any authorized or unauthorized use or activity in these areas if we are adhering to mitigation sequencing and best available science. The city should establish clear expectations for mitigation to ensure no net loss of ecological functions and values of these critical areas. Simply allowing activities to continue to persist that are negatively impacting these areas puts the city in a position to be out of compliance with the purpose of the Critical Areas Ordinance regulation established. The last chapter to be drafted will be 1526, Urban Forestry, which is not a requirement of the CAO, but it is important for the continued stewardship of our urban forest. Currently, multiple goals and policies exist in various long-range plans, identifying the need for tree canopy retention, specifically in our residential neighborhoods. While there has been recent progress towards that goal by implementing the City Shade Street Tree Program, clear regulation for tree protection standards in areas that are not already protected through the CAO should be better established. City street trees are the only trees we regulate in existing code. Clearing and grading regulations currently exempt the removal of trees from an entire city lot up to 7,000 square feet of disturbance. While we understand the need to increase housing density within the city, there also should be clear direction that allows for the balance of tree protection measures with development. We'll now move on to revisiting the questions we posed earlier in the work session, starting with question 1. What types of activities or uses should the city generally support within or near critical areas? Are there other examples or uses of activities that are unlikely to impact critical areas that we may want to consider exempt or allowed? How can the city best avoid the unconstitutional taking of property while also ensuring critical areas are not adversely impacted through reasonable use? Should we continue to permit those same uses as the underlying zone, such as various commercial, industrial, or residential uses, if they are also located in a critical area? The next question posed, are there activities or uses that the city should approach more cautiously? We may want to consider the continued use of viewshed enhancements, specifically in our geologically hazardous areas, higher risk activities within critical aquifer recharge areas, and the cleanup of previously degraded sites. The third question posed was, what factors should guide the city's approach to wetland protection? Some items to consider when directing policy around it are the intensity of the proposed use on the landscape and the wetland itself, the wetland rating and habitat values as determined by a qualified professional, what the surrounding uses are in the vicinity and whether the proposed use is inconsistent with those uses, and in a similar vein, what is allowed in the underlying zone, such as commercial, industrial, or residential uses. Question 4. How proactive should the city be in protecting critical aquifer recharge areas for potential future water use needs? Understanding that we do not currently use aquifer recharge areas for drinking water, how much oversight is appropriate when it comes to regulation in these areas? Should we simply consider the regulation of hazardous materials to prevent groundwater contamination? Should we be regulating the types of uses in these areas, including new commercial and industrial uses? Should special consideration be given to the regulation of agricultural activities and other ground disturbing activities that have the potential to contaminate or modify the quality or quantity of groundwater? Question 5. How should the city balance viewshed enhancement with the protection of our critical areas? Some things we may want to consider are the difference between industry practices and the abilities of our local contractors to adhere to those standards, the potential negative impact of not allowing any viewshed enhancement in critical areas, and how we can enforce malprinting practices, even when permits are received, given the constraints on our law enforcement officers and the difficulty in proving who did what and when. Question 6. What role should the city play in encouraging the restoration of previously degraded critical areas? If we are truly adhering to best available science and mitigation sequencing requirements, any impacts to a critical area or its buffer must be mitigated to ensure no net loss of the functions and values of these areas. At what point should the city step in and enforce the continued degradation of these areas, regardless of who or what is causing them. Special consideration should be given to the existing organizations already pursuing environmental restoration of fish and wildlife habitat areas specifically, and how the city can further support those efforts within city limits. Question 7, what approach should the city take toward tree retention and management on privately owned property? How much oversight should the city have on regulating tree management on privately owned versus publicly owned spaces? Are there other ways that we can reach those tree canopy coverage goals without additional oversight into tree protection standards? Should we focus our efforts on requirements for tree retention on already developed lots, tree protection standards on undeveloped lots, or both? There are multiple ways to approach a tree protection ordinance, but understanding the goals from council first will help staff with developing the corresponding regulation. And lastly, question 8. What principles should guide tree retention and management so that impacts and benefits are equitable across the community? As we continue to explore and develop the urban forestry chapter and subsequent urban forestry management plan, it's important that council considers tree maintenance from an equity standpoint. If we are going to require a certain number of trees be retained through development, or that trees of a certain size undergo review for removals, who will be responsible for paying for those reviews and subsequent removals, or maintenance associated with retaining trees in the right-of-way or on city property? How can we best incentivize tree protection and installations that benefit all community members and not just those who can afford to plant and protect trees on or adjacent to their property? To wrap up the discussion, the Planning Commission final review of the draft code will take place tomorrow, August 26th, with a public hearing scheduled for the September 23rd Planning Commission meeting. The October 20th City Council meeting will have the first reading of the ordinance, with the second reading and adoption scheduled for the November 17th meeting. In February of 2027, Q1 of 2027, staff plan to bring the urban forestry chapter to council for review. That concludes staff's presentation tonight. We are happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Courtney. If we can, I understand if you're watching online, you want to be able to see the council. And I'm also thinking, because we don't have the presentation in front of us, I have some points where I want to go back to the page. So if we could leave it up, but smaller, so the council chamber screen is available, and Navarra, if she speaks. I don't know if that's possible, but all right. And
Mayor, if it would be helpful, would you like the beginning of the PowerPoint, all 8 questions were fairly short, or would you prefer that we have the 8 questions at the end, which had kind of the sub questions to them? Would that be helpful?
Think let's start with the whole list on one screen, and then I have a question where I wanted to go back to the slide.
Bring
but
up slides 8 and 9, please.
So we'll start with 8. And also, just a clarification, because we're time limited tonight, just because I don't want to mess it up. Once we have them up, I should be able to tell. But some of these questions are related to significantly future decision making. So if we run short on time, it seems like it would be smart to, unless someone has a real clear, I think we should, that we should focus on the higher up, the questions that we need to, if there's something we want to suggest to Planning Commission that they change tomorrow night, in it that's time sensitive, we should focus on those.
And realizing if we don't get to it tonight, or something is thought of later, this will come back to council for 2 readings and action there as well.
Yes. Very good. All right. Would anyone like to start? I have a bunch of stuff written down, but
I'll start. Okay. I have a bunch of stuff written down too. So first I was hoping maybe we could get this sent to us as slide. We that could email to us later, the slideshow. Okay. So I'm just gonna be honest, I'm not gonna be able to answer a lot of these right now because I just want to be able to engage, but I will email. I just have some questions that I need clarification on just to help me out. So my first question had to do on slide 20. It has to talked about the director will make a decision. I just wanted some clarity on which director are we talking about. because I know that's come up in a lot of ordinances, and a lot of people have questions. So ultimately, it has to do with Article 1. Who makes the decision in that case?
That'd be community and economic development.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Mr. Goings, right? Or Shannon, yeah, okay. Well, that's good to know, because I mean, director, I don't know if it was mentioned earlier, that's something I want to know. On slide 22, it talked about compensatory mitigation. So I was hoping someone could maybe explain to me, like, is that a monetary amount paid in lieu of impacts made by a development? I was hoping maybe I could hear a little bit more about that.
So there are multiple ways to approach compensatory mitigation. A fee in lieu of is one example of those. That really gets flushed out during the mitigation plan development, which is prepared by the qualified professional. And there are strict requirements for what is necessary to be included in those mitigation plans. But yes, a fee is one option. A mitigation bank is another option. And then there are multiple ways of doing either restoration, rehabilitation, or potentially creation of new wetlands. So these are all specific to requirements from the Department of Ecology.
And will those be put in the code or in the handbook you're going
Yes,
to develop?
They will.
Okay. Awesome. Sweet. Moving on here. In Article 2, it talked about unauthorized uses and enforcement. Am I correct to assume that includes a conversation about people living in outdoor areas in our critical areas?
I'm just going to suggest, I know she's getting her steps, and you can probably
I just want to stand in for a second.
That would be one of the unauthorized uses, given the fact that most of the critical areas that we have in the city, the underlying zone is either public buildings and parks, and there are some industrial and commercial, but camping is not a permitted use in any of those zones. So any unauthorized camping would therefore be a violation of the critical areas ordinance.
Okay, awesome. There's a few more here. I can't even read my own handwriting. In Article 4, we talked about CARAs. I don't know, did I say that right? Mm-hmm. I was just wondering, do we have any of those in Port Angeles? Like, where are they?
They are currently mapped in the city based off of the criteria that's established from the natural resource conservation areas. We don't regulate them currently because we don't use them for drinking water at this time. I would like some guidance as to whether or not we should be thinking about regulating certain uses depending on what council feels is a good direction to move, especially given the nature of our increasing drought that we continue to have every summer.
And then just for my my knowledge, can you explain a little bit more about tree management and tree retention, because that's one area I don't know a whole lot about, and that's pretty prevalent, and to make some suggestions or comments on the questions, hopefully you can maybe just give a little bit more information to me about what that is.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we'll flush out later on with the urban forestry development chapter, which is not, again, part of the critical areas regulation. But viewshed enhancement is something that is specific to critical areas and our geologically hazardous areas specifically. So I think we want to be thinking about those two things separately, whether or not we want to allow people to continue to remove portions of trees to allow for view corridors of potentially the strait or the mountains in our critical areas. And then the additional tree management, which we'll consider later on, specific to tree retention. So if we're talking about, potentially retaining trees of a certain size or having to go through some sort of permit to have those trees removed, even if they are on private property. And that's, again, to help us reach those canopy coverage goals that are established in the comprehensive plan and the climate resiliency plan, and also to recognize the many communal benefits that large trees provide to our community.
Fantastic, because I just saw that a lot. I'm like, oh, hopefully I can get a little bit more information about what that is talking about. So that makes sense to me. So I'm just, in terms of some of these questions, I'm not going to answer them all, but with question 2, the activities and uses, I feel like that's going to need to be have careful consideration at our readings and stuff, because I think it has a lot to do with touching on our previous conversation about homelessness and encampments and stuff like that. So I would really feel like that deserves a robust conversation by council in the future. The number 4, yes, I think we should be proactive. Any kind of water sources we can protect for the future, I think, is in our vital interest in Port Angeles, as we are, seeing droughts all over the state and our Elwha River, lower water level. So I do think we should be very proactive in protecting those areas that could be beneficial in terms of water retention and use later. That's my opinion. Can we move to the next slide so you can see the other 4 questions? Thank you so much. And question 6, I think the city has a role to play in those areas. I would like to see the city be more involved in that in terms of how those degraded critical areas are restored, instead of relying on other community organizations. They are in our city limits. However, we should partner with people willing to do it, but I would like to see us take more of an active role in those things more than we are now, in my opinion. And then, for what you just talked about, question 5, I mean, views are awesome and people want that, but I do feel like in terms of watershed protection and shade and salmon habitat, I do think there needs to be enforcement of those areas. And I do know, like you mentioned so graciously, our police department has only a certain capacity, and code enforcement has only so many people and so many things they can do, that I feel like we do need to balance that and kind of work with the police department code enforcement and how that would be best enforced and what process that would go through. But I do think that's a really important thing to consider. Because I love views too, but I like our environment more. So those are some of my thoughts right now. I will definitely email you later with more complete thoughts on these 8 questions, and it's just so I can have some time to digest it, and I'll be watching the planning commission meeting tomorrow to kind of hear what they have to say too. So thanks for your presentation. I really appreciate you guys' expertise and the way in which you present this information. I think it's important and makes it really easy to understand and follow. So that's all I have, Madam Mayor. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Latricia, go ahead.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, John, for your comments. So I think in terms of critical areas, we've got riparian, we've got 5 streams going up through our beautiful city. We also have our shoreline, which are critical areas for us. So just kind of getting an idea. But our streams do go up into the mountains towards Olympic National Park. So whatever we do down here does impact Olympic National Park, and whatever Olympic National Park does, they impact us. So I think being neighborly is great. Your first question, so hard to answer. What type of activities or uses within or near critical areas? Well, of course, camping is not good. It impacts it. It's just not set up for camping. That definitely is an issue. But we live in a community that the footprint's already here. And so I think we have to be more active in recognizing that we have a footprint. We have industry around our critical areas. We have residential uses around our critical areas. We have parks around our critical areas. So kind of going and saying, well, you just can't do this or that near our critical areas is it's going to set us up to fail. But I think what we do need to have is strong, robust setbacks for those critical areas. One thing I didn't hear in your slide, and maybe it's just too much of a detail to actually talk about, is site potential tree height. I think we're going to have to implement that when it comes to development. And I think, unfortunately, your examples that you showed with setbacks, and you talked about exceptions. Was it exceptions? Yeah. Wetland buffers, things like that. I think there may be times where the city's just going to have to say no. And where there are those places, I think we need to have a program and work with our state legislatures to have a buyback program so that those lands that just aren't, it's not good for development because it's too close to critical areas. I think we need to participate in a program that we can purchase those properties back and permanently protect them with an easement. So let's see. What activities or uses should the city approach more cautiously? Anything that's associated with oil, sorry, or gasoline or diesel or things like that, because those are hard to clean in our critical areas. So I think we need to approach those. The other thing that we need to consider again is the amount of traffic around critical areas and how are we going to plan it. Roadways, the leaching, our stormwater, you didn't talk about that. We need to make sure that we're protecting and have the stormwater treatment before it goes into there because of the chemical in tires. I think that's important. Factors to guide city approach to wetland protection. Well, I think first factor is we need to know where they're at. So I think we need to make sure we have it all mapped. I think we need to have a very robust GIS mapping system that is not just available for staff, but it's available for the public. So there's overlays where they can see where the wetlands are at, where our critical areas are identified, where our wellhead protection areas are at, where aquifers are at. Going faster here. So I think our factors to guide approach is where are the wetlands and are they protected? Who's gonna do that? Well, I think the city should do that. Some of the things I do get concerned about is when we rely on, say, the landowner to go out and get a report about their project proposal and what their mitigation efforts are. Sometimes I worry about them hiring a contractor that will write a report that will allow them to do that. So how do we get a third-party entity that will do a report that benefits the environment, not the city or the landowner, but is a voice for the environment? That's a concern I have. The other concern I have, and maybe it's just too detailed, is when we do permitting, especially you had mentioned emergency permitting at the very beginning, and usually that happens along the near shore because it's flooding. That a lot of people, or in the past, what has happened is landowners reach out to do, I think is Fish and Wildlife, and they get an emergency permit, but then they have 5 years to finalize that permit. And sometimes that they either sell that property and that new property owner doesn't know. There's a lack of communication between the state regulators and the permitters here. You need to have a solid thing there that there's that communication is ongoing and that you receive that notification right away that an emergency permit was initiated, because it doesn't happen automatically and it is an issue. It's an issue in the county and I don't want it to be an issue here in the city. I'm just going to jump to aquifers. Yes, 100% protected. It needs to be used as a future source switch for us, for the city when it comes to water, because you can use aquifers as a source switch for water, especially when the Elwha River gets low. You can switch over to an aquifer. I don't know where we have an aquifer here in the city. I'm sorry, I'm more focused on Dungeness. You can also partner with, you can use aquifers for development too. You can partner, there's other agencies that will manage an aquifer, create an LLC, things like that. So you could do that. Tree retention, I think, is vital, especially when it comes to carbon sequestration. We want to make sure that we protect our tree canopy, tree shed, not just for carbon sequestration, but also to help keep the temperatures cool. I know when I have a tree in front of my house, boy, it's a lot cooler than having no trees out there to keep my house cool. We should play an active role in restoration of degraded critical areas. Rainier Mill is one. Valley Creek is another. The estuaries are important. The lagoon, it'd be nice to have that restored. There's lots of areas we should be playing an active role, but I think that's we're gonna need capacity. We're gonna need another Courtney. So I'm gonna push for another Courtney that's out in the field all the time, partnering with those entities to play that active role. And also enforcement. We're going to need additional enforcement. We only have what we currently have in the police department, and with camping being one of those issues that we're not going to have allowed, most likely, or not going to speak for everybody, but it sounds like we may be going that way. We're definitely going to need enforcement to make that happen. So those are my comments right now. You had a lot of sub questions and I'm not going to answer them all. So just if you could send them to us and I can send you some more thoughts, but it's a lot to unpack in 2 hours. So if I have any more comments, I'll speak up, but I'll pass the torch.
Thank you. Other folks in council chambers. I do have Navarra online with a hand raised. I will go to Drew and then Navarra.
This was probably mentioned if I listened even closer, but I just wanted to find out real fast. One of the slides was talking about how there'll be no topping or felling of trees. One, does that impact the trees near the airport? So like the actual city-owned trees?
So that is specific to viewshed enhancement.
Okay.
And no, those are not critical areas in that location.
Okay, and I didn't think so. The other one, though, that I think does hit right in the middle of this is I know the waterfront district is trying to open up the viewable area behind Red Lion on the south side. Mm-hmm. Are these changes going to make that more difficult than it already is for that?
Not necessarily. I think it will shift the trajectory of the project, but it won't make it more difficult, I would say.
Okay. And then, yes, you guys gave us so many good questions. I wish I had them sooner. I do appreciate, I think Carrie emailed us the slide deck. So I will, during this meeting, Carrie emailed the slide deck to us. So I'll spend some time and go through and try to give you guys better notes.
Thank you. I will go to Navarra.
Thank you. Great presentation. I have some comments and I think some questions as well. The first is that I think we have to see some maps here. Because when I think about Port Angeles,
I can't hear you.
I'm thinking about...
If you can hear me, we can't hear you. It seems that maybe your WebEx is looking for a different input than whatever online meeting platform you used last on your computer.
Can you hear me now?
What happened to me? My Zoom, if you go to audio, it may let you switch. Also, if you go to audio, if you can't get it working, it gives you a number that connects your phone to your login. So why don't we come back to you in just a second? Sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Mark, go ahead.
Thanks for the presentation. I think after being able to sit down with a slide deck, we'll be able to have a little bit more well thought out questions. A couple things that stand out for me is I'm glad the aquifers are being brought up and protecting them. You said that they are mapped.
They're currently mapped on the Clallam County GIS web mapping services. We don't have them mapped internally currently, but moving forward, GIS integration will be a huge part of the implementation of this critical areas ordinance. So we would get those mapped on our website as well.
And it wouldn't require new surveying, correct? It would just be a matching
Correct.
already created product. Awesome. Great. Well, that's a high priority for me on that one. Protecting future water sources like aquifers. Number 6. Sorry, I'm just writing down notes. If I could see number 6, I can remember what that was. Yeah, a large role, a leadership role. That's and I think that that's what the community has been asking. Okay, and then I'll save the rest of my questions for email, but code enforcement, we currently have 2 code enforcement officers, is that correct? Okay, get nods for yes. Okay, thank you.
Mayor, let's go ahead and take a break.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Can you hear us? Mayor, let's just take a break and we'll try to sort through this.
Take a 5-minute break.
Oh, my mic's not even on. We're going to take a 5-minute break.
Think about this.
Can you hear me? Okay, that looks like success.
Can you tell her we're taking a...
Can you hear us?
I can. I can see the 5-minute break happening. I needed to log out and log back in.
Okay. Anyway.
Take credit for Got like 700. That's my math professor had her head with the entire curriculum. And rewind it at the end of the year. He like built that over one summer and he was like, summer vacation. Geometry isn't changing.
Yeah, right.
I was just it. No, what?
Can you hear me, Navarra? Okay, go ahead when
Yes.
you're
Okay. Well, first, I apologize. I could hear everything, but apparently couldn't say anything. So, but I appreciate taking the break and helping me figure it out. So, what I wanted to say is that first, I think it'd be really helpful to see some maps, because when I think about Port Angeles, I'm not sure which areas aren't in our critical areas. Because I think, as Latricia mentioned, we have a number of stream corridors which are flowing underneath many of our roads. So do those count? At what point do our creek corridors count as critical areas, right? Our shoreline, that seems to be a critical area. Our ravines, right? It goes on. And so I think being able to see the aquifers, another great one. I think being able to see on a map all of these areas would actually be very helpful in order to be able to determine what we should be doing, because we need to have a community where we can all live here. And we should also have strong codes that prohibit development in critical areas. What I'm concerned about is that I could tell you where the obvious ones are, but we have people living and working in many of those areas. And so I think to be able to make and pass good policy, we just need to be able to know where those places are in an actual, like, visual and tangible way, and not a more abstract way. And so I'd really appreciate that in the next iteration of the presentation, which I'm sure we'll get at the future meetings. Additionally, I wanted to ask a question about what about the areas built on fill? So all of downtown, to my understanding, right, we all know sluicing the Hodback is built on fill. And while that may not be a critical area for the purposes of, like wetland restoration or salmon, I think when we're talking about climate change mitigation, it certainly comes into play. And maybe that's addressed somewhere else in some other piece of one of our many plans. But it seems like when we're talking about, our shoreline, since it is a natural shoreline, what are we doing about that? Additionally, I think as myself and many other council members have mentioned over the years, and became, I think, maybe a little bit of a flashpoint at our comprehensive planning at the end of last year, I'd like us to revisit net ecological gain. I think, former council member Sherman Warren and I, along with many other members of the public and organizations that we partner with, talked about the importance of net ecological gain, and how those are the best available standards that are being utilized at this time. And so and I could be remembering this wrong, but what I remember being told by other council members at that point was that there was not enough public opportunity to be able to have those discussions. And if we don't have that discussion now as a part of our critical areas ordinances, then frankly, I don't know when we would be having it. And so I hope that those are conversations that have been talked about at the Planning Commission meetings, and certainly come back to us at council. There's, again, things I will be bringing up again, and I think this is a great opportunity for the public to comment. It sounds like there's been a lot of other opportunities through the public comment process, and so I would hope that our staff have been incorporating comments about different environmental standards, particularly ones that are based on best available science. Additionally, I am concerned about the variances. And part of this is because I think over the years, not just for this, but for a lot of various issues, I think community members have felt like there has been selective enforcement based on, certainly a number of factors, right? We didn't have code enforcement for a long time, whatever, right? People who complain are the ones that get their, issues enforced. So I understand this, but I hear community complaints all the time about why are certain things being enforced and others not. I think this has also come up in our conversations earlier this year around the unhoused. And so I think when we're building out a policy to talk about our critical areas, this goes back to what I was saying previously about, well, our mill is in what I would imagine to be a critical area. Most of the port buildings are in areas that I would consider to be critical areas. Certainly, the marina, right? Like we have a huge amount of infrastructure on our shoreline that I don't necessarily think is bad. I certainly don't think it's bad. In fact, I wish we had more public infrastructure on our shoreline. So all to say, but that requires smart and strategic development, right? And so my concern is that if we're taking, like, on the one hand, if we're taking a one-sized, if you're engaged in a non-permitted use in our critical areas, then, sorry to be you're going to be arrested. Great, except that what are we doing about the big businesses who can pay, right? What are we doing about the people who have enough pull to be able to get, to be able to basically bend our ear as council members, be able to really put in those applications in a way that the most vulnerable and the poorest people among us are not. So I want to make sure that we don't have selective enforcement for, first, how the enforcement of this ordinance goes into effect. And then second, I want to make sure that the way that we're considering who gets variances is a very specific and laid out process. Because I think we've seen over the years that folks have been concerned that I think particularly we heard a number of public comments in email about the Amazon project being one of those places that seem to be slated for a variance, and we received a number of public comments. So I want to know, I want there to be a process for what those variances look like so that everybody can be clear that, you know, it doesn't matter who you are, nobody's getting special treatment. And I'm not trying to say that that is what has been happening, but I think it's important that we lay out those processes so that there's no ambiguity. Additionally, I wanted to mention, Courtney, you mentioned eelgrass beds and kelp beds, and I was really delighted to hear you mention that because I think it is one of our critical areas that most people don't get to see or interact with very often. I certainly, the way that I interact with them is through sailing, but I know that other people interact with them in other ways like diving or just being out in the ocean. And something I wanted to talk about is that when we're thinking about how to protect our eelgrass beds, one of the things that we'll have to consider is whether or not we're going to continue to allow people to anchor in our harbor. We currently have huge tankers who anchor there. We also have private people who anchor there. And I think it's a huge benefit to our community to have, you know, we're a harbor. We obviously have boats for, you know, for business and for pleasure. I think that's fabulous. I obviously have one of those boats. So I think it's incumbent on us to think about ways that we can encourage people to use our harbor in a way that is the least harmful. And one of those ways is through mooring buoys. Certainly not the tankers. I think they're in a class of their own. But when we're thinking about, again, like who gets access and who doesn't, right? Are we prioritizing big business or are we prioritizing kind of the little guy? And I think that's always, I think, sort of the tension that communities have. And I think that that's a hard line to walk. But I think that as we're talking about protection of these areas, we have to be doing so in a way that is consistent and doesn't prioritize some people over others. So anyhow, back to mooring buoys, it allows people to tie up at those mooring balls during times when our docks wouldn't be out there, or for longer periods of time than our docks allow. A lot of times they're also cheaper than tying up at docks. But if we were to have more available like public dock space, we might be able to reduce some of the harmful anchoring practices that affect eelgrass beds. I know that's really very specific and maybe wasn't really what we were trying to go for here, but I think it's always worthwhile to talk about. I also just wanted to echo really everything that Latricia said, but particularly around protecting the aquifers and water storage. I think this is something that has come up multiple times when we have talked with our dear friends at the county, that they would like us, as we think about how we protect our watershed at the Elwha, to think about other ways to expand where we're able to get our water. And I believe Courtney was mentioning earlier too that that we're in a drought and we just have to be considering these things in a way that maybe past councils didn't have to. And so it's not something I really would have known about, and I really appreciate getting to learn more now and certainly learning more in the future. I also think, and I'll kind of end here, that I think when it comes to tree retention and management, again, Latricia was mentioning that the trees that she has provide shade. The trees in my yard also provide shade, but my house is in a very strange microclimate, mostly because of my neighbor's trees. And I think it's worth remembering that, we live in a community, right? And so the impact that one neighbor has does impact the people around them, whether or not we would like that to be true. And so I think it's important to think about, and I think that we've been doing this pretty consistently in the last number of years since I've been on council at least, but really thinking holistically about our tree canopy right through street tree program, now through this, and thinking about how what our urban tree canopy looks like. And so I think we can't forget that these aren't individual parcels that exist in a vacuum. Everybody relies on everybody else's infrastructure in different ways that might not be noticeable. I also don't think that we should have different regulations for new development versus development that's already been here, because on the one hand, I don't think we want to make it harder to build on those lots or new lots. But I also think we need to find ways to make sure that people don't feel unfairly punished, like based on previously owning a home or being able to afford to buy a new parcel. And so I think that's something that we'll have to balance. I feel like as I was saying that, I wanted to say one more thing. So just give me a sec. I'm going through the questions. Oh, I really want to talk about, and I kind of talked about this at the beginning, but I think, again, this talks about sort of access and what is a critical area. I think we have to talk about our bluffs. And this came up during our climate mitigation plan, and whether or not we were going to allow people to build new developments on our bluffs that we all know are, crumbling into the sea or crumbling down onto country air, and or Drew's business, and think about how we are mitigating those sort of negative effects, the literal downstream effects on that of the bluff erosion, and who is who's being impacted by that. And so I think, again, as we move forward and thinking about what a critical areas plan looks like I think Latricia's thought about larger buffer areas is a really good one, because it's either we tell people you got to go, right, but how those are a lot of homes on top of those bluffs that are at immense risk, both for the people who live there and the people who live down below. And so, and us as the taxpayers and the city, who I think will likely be the entity bailing them out. And so I think we have to be able to consider those things in a critical areas ordinance. And again, I'm pretty concerned about how we're going to be enforcing whether or not people get to stay on those areas that they already are on, versus how we decide what new developments or not new developments go in. And so I'm hoping to see more of that in subsequent presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Navarro. All right. I have it's interesting because I wrote a lot of questions down, and some of them are just slightly different approaches to the same things that people have already said, but so I will go through those quickly. But a couple of general questions. First, a comment. I'm glad we're doing this. I'm glad we're updating things. It's consistent with our plan to update all of our code anyway. And I think I recognize that individual projects, there's often nuance around the things that are happening with those projects. And it's really important to me that if you come in, especially with something like this, that if you come in and talk to someone about your project and they say, oh yeah, no problem. And then a week later you come back and that person's on vacation and you're talking to someone else and they're like, oh, what? No, you can't do that. Maybe a week isn't enough time for anyone to have spent any money, but I think that updating this to be as clear as we can without being overly, we don't need to be in the minutia probably, but I appreciate that this will give us an opportunity to move closer to that too, with updated definitions and that sort of thing. So that's just my big picture comment. One of the questions I'm curious about is the comparable cities. How many of them, if any, or maybe all of them, are also single water source cities? I'm just curious. And if you don't know off your top of your head,
that is a good question that I don't know off the top of my head.
No need to have it answered right now. Another question similar is, do we know how many qualified professionals exist in this community for people to hire to meet the kind of standards that we're discussing?
Again, I don't know that exact number
Yeah.
off the top of my head. I know that the county has a list of qualified
Okay.
professionals that they disseminate to property owners. We don't have that list.
Well, the fact
though.
that it's more than a qualified professional and that they actually have a list is encouraging. That was one of the, just a concern in thinking about, not that we shouldn't do it, but that I don't want to create a rule that no one can do anything about because they can't find someone to help them. Another sort of general question, again, doesn't need to be answered right now, but would this include the UGA? And I'm thinking specifically about the proposed swap that we incorporated into the comp plan. Just city limits right now.
City limits.
So when,
Yes.
if and when we incorporate, okay. Then let's see. I am in agreement with what I think is the consensus of council that the aquifer piece is really important. We certainly are not seeing right in the probably not this winter, a lot of snowpack and things like that. And I think, we've been in a statewide drought for a while, and I don't see that improving significantly. I'm not a scientist, so who knows, but it seems to be a trend that we're dealing with. And so consistent with the project in our capital facilities plan for potential groundwater, if all that groundwater is contaminated, then what's the point? You could probably use it for putting out fires, but maybe not. So I think also thinking about what kinds of activities you asked, and I think this is a little weedy, but agricultural stuff, I think, could potentially become more important as things shift around the world. While I know that can be problematic, I hope that we would have some, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, exemption or something for, like, if you're doing a kind of biodynamic farming that isn't generating potential contaminants, that sort of thing. And then, of course, there are some other uses that we are going to be talking about coming up that, depending on how they're implemented, are really screwing up people's aquifers. So I think this will be a helpful component of that. I have a bunch of questions about trees, but I'll ask those at a different time. I think, sorry, I have notes. I sort of tried to keep them in a place. I guess I do have one specific question. On page 19, there is a comment about, I think it's about exemptions. Is it possible to, Mandy, to move the slides ahead to slide 19? I just want to make sure I'm referencing that right. It was like a thought as we were moving past the slide. Okay. In this, something you said made me question whether the state is just unilaterally exempt. And so I'm like, if they were doing something in our community, I mean, I know there's like federal rules about permitting and stuff, but I'm just, something you said made me wonder if, well, I think it's this forest practice is regulated by the state.
Right.
So
those are specific to an RCW that regulates forest practices. It does not exempt the state itself.
Okay. That's helpful. All right. I don't have any other questions right now because everything else is future stuff. So I'll ask you about those later. Okay. Anyone have additional thoughts? Okay, Latricia, go ahead.
I wanted to go back to the Navarra, she brought up shorelines, bluff erosion. And I think that there's kind of two different types of potential erosion. You've got your erosion from stormwater runoff, which I think is more associated with the bluff that sits there. I think it's 3rd Street right there. That's more stormwater erosion and stormwater management. And I don't know if that's part of critical areas or maybe it can get tied into critical areas because it does cause erosion, which could lead to unstable your a geological hazard issue. And then your other is just erosion along the shoreline, which is also kind of associated with stormwater runoff, but also from tides and wave action, not tides, sorry. Erosion based on wave action. But I want to hit on shoreline again, which I think is important, especially in our community. A lot of the downtown corridor is shoreline. I think one of the things that we have existing infrastructure in critical areas and shoreline areas. And I love all of our bike trails and trails that people can walk on. But I think that we can do a better job of protecting our critical areas and our shoreline by looking at ways that we can re-examine how to provide near shore trails that maybe provides a more immersive experience that brings that trail out over the waterways. We think that, oh, we can't build anything over the water. Well, that's not really true. You can develop trails and bike paths and footpaths out over the waterways while protecting our near shore. I want to be clear. I'm not advocating for removing bike paths or footpaths. I'm just saying that there is better ways that you can provide trails very adjacent to where they already are at downtown and not eliminating anything. I remember my first year, I made this suggestion, and I think we weren't able to have the discussion because I was accused of advocating of getting rid of the trail downtown, which I want to be clear, I'm not. I'm just saying that we can build an immersive trail bike path that goes over the waterway, that the impact to the waterway, you can build it in a way that is not harmful, but yet we can protect our near shore. We also have other areas that we've talked about for years. The Edis Hook, the riprap. We've talked about having a more natural bluff or protection using large wood and shoreline plants and stuff. And we really haven't made much effort, or not, we've made effort. Sorry, we haven't made much progress to making that happen. And I think it's vital as we talk about needing to protect these critical areas and wanting our residents to protect it. I think it's vital that the City of Port Angeles protect it and that we make a plan to move forward, to move infrastructure out of critical areas, but yet make sure that, again, I'm not advocating for removing the downtown Olympic Discovery Bike Trail. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we can create an immersive that goes over the water that is as enjoyable or even more enjoyable. Lots of communities have done it, and I've seen it done fabulously, and I think we can do that too. But I also know too that in the future, as we look at Rainier property, we do want to see that developed. We want to see our downtown near shore developed, and it can be done in a way. So I think our critical areas ordinance needs to make sure that we have strong codes in there that we can direct people or guide people on that, how that development can happen that is friendly to the environment. So I just want to say that. So, and I want to be clear, I am not advocating for the elimination of our bike trails. I love them, and I think they're important and they're valuable, and we heard it from our community. I'm advocating that we make it even better and keep it in the same area, right? Just immersive over the waterfront. But I mean, that's going to cost a lot of money. So it's probably not going to happen in maybe, my 10, 20 years. But if we could make it happen, I think it would be fabulous. There was another point, I think, Kate, that you brought up that I wanted to refer to, but I can't think of it right now, but if I think of it, I'll jut in. So that's what I wanted to say. And I also want to say thank you, Navarra, for bringing up net ecological gain. Oh, I remember what it was. When we do mitigation, that money needs to stay in our area. That mitigation can't go outside of the city of Port Angeles. It needs to be in our area and keep that money locally. And I don't know if it's a good idea to even consider moving it from one river or one riparian area to another riparian area. And I think it should stay in that riparian area, or at least that's my thought. So I don't know. I guess we can have further discussion on mitigation and stuff. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you. All right, anyone else? Hope anything? I think everyone's going to go home and at like 11, you're going to be like, "Ooh, I have a question." So write it down, send it early so that people have, the staff has time to consider. It is helpful. It is helpful for, I mean, I think there was some consensus around a few issues tonight that you can bring back as areas, I hate to use that word, of importance for Planning Commission. And then I really appreciate the length of time that you scheduled between the Planning Commission public hearing and it coming back to council, because I do think it gives time to be more sure that what comes to the first public hearing is incorporating what needs to be incorporated before we get to, so we're not scrambling at the last minute to try to make changes. And we may anyway, but the timeline I think works really well for being able to incorporate things as we go forward. So we don't need to stay later if, I mean, we could all talk about this. Again, this could be a retreat, but I think everyone has shared what they wanted to share. Yep.
Port Townsend does a good job of that moorage. So if you need a reference, Port Townsend does the moorage for boats and stuff. Their MRC out there has been the lead in that project. So the Jefferson County MRC could give you some good advice.
Thank you. Any last comments from staff? All right. Well, thank you very much. And now we have the presentation too. We can go through that, and we'll look forward to hearing your report from the Planning Commission. And I just want to remind everyone, it is not noticed as a council meeting, so be mindful if you, it sounds like at least one person was planning to attend. So anyway, thank you. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.